Today's presentation is around scaling Agile, and as Agile and Scrum adoption rates at mid to large-sized companies expand, they become increasingly more mainstream. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to organizing and initiating an Agile program, but today's session provides a framework for effectively initiating Agile projects and establishing scalable program models that support sustainable, value-focused teams. Our presenter today is George Schlitz. He is a Principal Agile Coach and co-founder of Big Visible Solutions. George has a diverse background covering many areas of software product development, including 8 years involved in Agile product development. He is a certified Scrum coach and a certified project management professional. And with that, I'll turn it over to George.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I apologize on behalf of my colleague Giora, who was also supposed to be here, but he couldn't be here for personal reasons. I've been an Agile coach now for some years. Before that, a Scrum Master, Project Manager, and Developer way before that. What we're going to talk about today is a method that we use to take Agile to the program level. We're going to talk about some of the constructs, some of the ceremonies, some of the feedback loops that we introduce so that we can take what we learn from Scrum and apply it to larger projects. What we've done here has worked for us on projects up to over 20 teams, all working together on related products or sometimes even on the same product. So, real brief blurb about Big Visible. We're an Agile services organization. Our goal is to enable and train teams and organizations in implementation and scaling of Agile methods and lean thinking, using lean thinking and Agile methods. All of us have coached at the team, project, and program level, so we've all worked in big organizations on large projects, not just small projects delivering software. Our principals have worked at the enterprise level, again, in big Fortune class organizations in many different industries. So the stuff we've done has worked equally well in financial services, manufacturing, and others. We speak regularly at regional and national conferences, as well as groups such as PMI groups. And where we have a regional focus in Boston, basically Northeast and Southwest, and Southern California. So we have a lot to cover today. Again, we're going to be focused on some of the program-level constructs of scaling Agile. So here's the agenda. We're going to talk about an initiation roadmap. Because one of the things that we realize is that when introducing Agile to large organizations or anything more than a team, it's often useful to have something of a plan so that we can spend time-box period of time initiating the program, making sure everybody understands what's going on. I'm sorry, I'm having some slide advancing issues here. Okay, then we're going to talk about how we do some stakeholder analysis. None of this stuff takes a long time, but we do want to spend some time understanding who has a stake in the project as well as who has a stake in the process. That often involves interviews and involves talking to people outside of the project team that we might typically be involved with. We're going to talk about the organizational model that we use. How do we take Agile and how do we create an Agile program, including roles at the program level, how teams interface together, how do we resolve obstacles across teams and do more holistic things like architecture and infrastructure and deal with organizational groups that might be impacted by the change. We'll also talk briefly about distributed teams. That's a whole big topic, so I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on it. Some strategies as well as challenges and success factors. I'm going to start with the initiation roadmap. This is something we found effective, and in every engagement, this changes somewhat. This is more of a model. We modify it based on client needs. But the important thing to note here is that we spend some time, brief periods of time, doing some stuff preparing the organization, preparing ourselves. Some things to keep in mind when you look at this, it looks like a waterfall type plan. But everything here is concurrent. Everything here also is ongoing. So you'll see some of the shaded boxes, the things that actually go on during the entire project. They don't just end after week 1, for example. So when we start the project, we do some initial stakeholder analysis. That includes people on the team, that includes executives, that includes organizational groups that we're going to have to interface with. Understand where this project fits within the organization and all the people they're going to have to be interfacing with. Some people may be used to having to deal with groups like compliance groups and architecture and infrastructure groups that aren't part of the typical project team, but are absolutely crucial in getting our software promoted to production and other things. I'm sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties with the slides. It's advancing automatically. Okay. The purpose of identifying those stakeholders and interviewing them is that so we can achieve alignment. So everybody who's going to be working with the project or partially responsible in the project succeeding understands what Agile is and how it's going to affect them and how we're going to interact together. So at the end of that, we'll define some shared goals and objectives for the Agile program. That's all under this umbrella of initiating the program. Similar to that, we'll start forming the teams, and we're going to discuss how we form our teams and scale them to the program level and provide training for those teams. And after that, we're going to move into a discovery session. It says business discovery there, but it's really much more than business discovery. It includes a whole bunch of things, including preparation of a backlog, understanding how we're going to manage that backlog and how the product owner is going to own the backlog and share backlogs across teams. And we'll talk about a few models for doing that. But it also includes technical discovery as well, understanding what a conceptual architecture might be. And you'll see that activity continues for the course of the project. We'll do some initial workshops in the beginning to baseline people's expectations and come up with a shared vision technically and from a business perspective. But that's going to evolve over time. And again, we're going to get into who owns that holistic view of the program later. Then we'll move into an iteration 0, which you've probably heard of if you're familiar with Agile. A lot of people have been introducing this concept of an iteration 0 where we get some basic infrastructure in place for the teams to be executing. Basically create an environment where the team can get its job done. Some common activities include getting continuous integration running, getting all the tools team members need, access to environments, maybe doing some technical spikes if there are some unknown technology challenges to face, things like that. And then finally, assessment, which I believe is a really important part of any Agile introduction. First, baselining how the teams are working together, assessing them in a bunch of objective criteria on how mature they are as a team, how much they know about the Agile practices, and then reassessing over time, perhaps every release, it depends on the organization, so that we can prioritize the improvements we're going to make. So I'm going to start with stakeholder. What I like to do on Agile programs is create a model. Now this is not a big formal diagram or anything like that, but what it is an understanding of who all the stakeholders are on the program, not just team members, not just the product owner, but also business stakeholders, which may include users or business executives, IT stakeholders, like managers in groups that we have to interface with, such as infrastructure, operations, I mentioned a few of these. Compliance people are often stakeholders, especially if you are in a heavily regulated industry, as many of our clients are. Understanding their roles and how they're going to interface with the project team so that we can help them adjust their expectations. I apologize, it seems to be advancing automatically again. So what we want to do is make sure that they're receiving similar education to the teams, because oftentimes I see situations where organizations just dove into Agile, and they started with a development team just going off on its own, picking up a book on Scrum or maybe getting some brief training, and just starting to execute, and the organization doesn't know how to deal with that. Suddenly they have challenges when they have to release things to production because they have to go through this formal compliance process, and they're not sure how. And it usually causes a lot of challenge. Sometimes that results in the Agile endeavor, even though it results in successful product development, the organization itself rejects Agile because we haven't spent enough time educating stakeholders and other groups on how to work together. So what we also want to do is get a clear communication interaction model. This sounds like it's a lot of things, but it really doesn't have to be heavyweight at all, and we'll move on to that in a second. Okay, and finally, identify success measures. These include goals, shared goals, as well as things we are actually going to measure in metrics, which we can talk about later as well. So what do we have to educate stakeholders about? A truth about Agile is that these programs are different, and not just different from a delivery and a software development perspective. As we know, the Agile principles are extremely, they can be extremely foreign to people who are used to delivering with traditional waterfall methods. What we do is based on principles, primarily. And there are different practices and different artifacts, so to speak, that people will have to get used to. No longer are we going to be basing progress on documents or deliverable progress. It's more based on actual product delivered and things like that. Artifacts like the product backlog as opposed to a big Microsoft project plan. These are things that are going to be new to PMOs. They're going to be new to everybody in the organization. How do we assess progress? All this stuff is new. We'll have new vocabulary, like no longer will we be calling a project manager, maybe they're called a Scrum Master now or an iteration manager. Again, the artifact focus is shifted to product. This requires education of our stakeholders. We have to spend time with them to help them understand what they're dealing with so that they can best support the teams. And we want to make sure we're spending enough time doing that. Those stakeholders are also going to need guidance. So if you have coaching, which is something I highly recommend, that coaching should help not just the teams execute better, but also help the organization support those teams. So here's an example of a big topic for education, stories. Stories are basically the planning and building unit of Agile teams. They're a replacement for what we used to know as requirements, but they're not requirements. Here are some examples of stories, and if any of you are familiar with waterfall processes or RUP or any of these other things, what you have there is use cases or very big requirements documents. We're going to replace them with small things like this, which we refer to as an invitation for a future conversation. Again, back to the focus on teams and collaboration, we're going to elaborate on what those things mean more detailed when teams are about to execute those things. So getting stakeholders to understand this can be a big challenge. So an important point is that stories aren't requirements. They're a new representation of requirements. But again, having people understand how do we develop stuff when we're not doing a bunch of detailed planning can be difficult. Another example, you might have a traditional project management office used to certain types of reporting and certain types of tracking. We have a whole different set of reports. I believe they're more effective, but they're absolutely different. No longer do we have things like percent completion and green, yellow, red status, which kind of gloss over a whole bunch of details, I believe. Now we have things like burn down charts. How do we teach a portfolio management office that needs to approve project funding how to assess the progress of Agile projects? This is another example of stakeholder education. So how do we teach those portfolio managers also to focus on business objectives? It gives them a lot of power. Even though it's different, there's huge benefit to learning this stuff because we offer much more powerful information that allows people to make funding decisions much more frequently. Point here is that those stakeholders need to be educated as the teams do. Okay, so what I want to do now is dive into the program model. How do we organize the team, the Agile program? So when we organize the Agile program, we have some goals. Here are a few of them. Independent team units. One of the great benefits of Agile is that teams are self-organized. We want to make sure that teams can proceed on their own as much as possible. So despite the fact that they may have some holistic goals across a large program, anything we can do to facilitate that will result in greater success for us. So we'll talk about that in a second. Anything we could do to make sure that teams can operate as independent Scrum teams is going to make us more effective. Distributed backlog management. This supports the independent team units. Each team should have its own backlog that it can manage and can make decisions about. Again, so that there's not some program-level bottleneck, and so that each of those can result in its own learning, and then feed that learning back up to the program level. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Cross-team communication. It's very easy when implementing Agile in silos on teams to neglect this particular part because teams can go off on their own. They can do all sorts of things, and since they're empowered and they're self-organizing, there's a risk of those teams all going off in their own direction, technically and from a business perspective if they each have their own product owner. We want to make sure we have a model that encourages cross-team communication and a holistic plan as well as independent team plans. Program-level feature prioritization. This is especially important if you have one source of funding and it needs to be spread across many different products. We'll talk about a few different product models that we've seen and some ways that we handle program-level feature prioritization. How do we decide if we have 3 teams and 10 products are being developed by these 3 teams? How do we decide which stories get done in those? We'll talk about that very briefly a little bit later. And team-level story prioritization. So this is where the teams are independent. Once we get stories to teams, they're empowered to prioritize those in a way that supports the program-level goals. So let's start. This is going to be very familiar for you, those of you that are very familiar with Scrum, because we're going to start with a basic Scrum team. We'll start with, this is a team. If each one of those squares is another person on the team. Every team has a Scrum Master, or you might not be using Scrum, so you may be used to some of these other terms like an iteration manager or a team lead. The point is each team has one dedicated. Each team has a product owner, otherwise known as a customer or the voice of the truth, some XP terms there. I'm not going to get into the details of what these roles do because that's just the basic Scrum stuff. Each team has its own story backlog. This is really important so that they can function as a unit and not rely too much, except for in the long term, on holistic prioritization. So otherwise known as team backlog or story list. So every team plans, size, and manages its own backlog. So we like to have a product owner in every team. This is, again, basic Scrum. They meet in stand-ups. They have the normal ceremonies. We recommend the Scrum ceremonies, which are planning, daily stand-ups, review meeting, retrospective at least. Now, how do we take that model, which is the basic Scrum team, and scale it now to a 4-team organization? Perhaps they all have to develop the same system, and it's a really big system. Here's an example of 4 teams of slightly different sizes. Each one of them has their Scrum Master, product owner, and backlog. And we have a program-level construct called the Scrum of Scrums. It's really a coordination of Scrum Masters. Now, it can also be, I've seen it work where dev leads on each one of those teams, or a member of each one of those teams meets in this daily meeting. Usually this meeting is daily. It can be less frequently depending on the needs of your project. But I like to have those meetings daily where a member of each one of those teams meets in a Scrum meeting, which is basically the same as a team Scrum meeting, except it has additional question like, what are you going to put in the other team's way? So we'll do the normal Scrum questions, and each member of each representative of the teams also answers the question, what things do you need from other teams, or what things are you going to put in other teams' way? This way we can start tackling cross-team issues, cross-team dependencies, things like that. And when we're having that every day, it's very easy to communicate, and it's very easy to resolve things that are blocking teams when they're working on similar products, or the same product for that matter. That's the project management side, or the Scrum Master side of the program coordination. So we do have a coordinator for all that, known as the Uber Scrum Master. That may have been known as something like a program manager. There's some discussion about whether a program manager is the same, or whether a project manager is the same as a Scrum Master, but that's probably another topic. On the product side, we have a similar construct known as the Meta Scrum. And they meet regularly, probably not as frequently as the Scrum of Scrums, but their goals are similar, but more from a product perspective. The product owners meet. It can be daily. I have seen organizations where it's daily, where you have a very quick release cycle, but usually it's a little less frequently in my experience. It's been about every week or so. And this product team is led by an Uber product owner. This is a critical role when you have a situation where there are multiple products that this team is developing, because that Uber product owner is going to be responsible for the cross-product prioritization of the shared backlog, which we'll get into in a second. They're even important for single products that are going through all these teams. If all 4 of these teams were working on a single product, the Uber product is going to help resolve prioritization challenges, scheduling challenges when we're talking about dependencies, and they're a person that requirements issues can be escalated to if we need to consider them at a more holistic level. So the product team prioritized consolidated program backlog. In the Meta Scrum, there are common agenda items such as, what is our next release? How are we progressing relative to the goals of that next release? Are we slipping on any stories that might impact one of our release goals? So their focus tends to be at the release level. It tends to be on higher level goals than specific stories. Whenever one of the individual product owners has a situation where the release goals may be impacted, they're going to talk about it in this Meta Scrum with the other product owners, and they'll make a decision. Maybe that'll result in next iteration prioritization. Ideas also can be shared here. If one team discovers something that may result in future stories, they can discuss it in this meeting. We actually encourage that discussion to happen anytime, but if it doesn't happen in real time, it can always be caught in this meeting so that the Uber product owner can consider new stories, can consider the impact of of changes and learning on each of those teams and adjust the release plan appropriately. The result is prioritization of this program backlog. And one of the next topics is different models of managing that backlog, which is a common challenge. So here's one of those models. The program backlog can be a consolidation of the team backlogs, or it can be the driver of the team backlogs. So here's one of the models, top down. I've seen this work on a homogeneous program. We have one product, and that product, the prioritization across teams has to be fueled in a centralized way and then distributed to the team backlogs. So we identify all the stories at the Uber product owner level. The product owners may the team product owners may very well be involved in that. But the result here is the prioritization from the program level backlog results in each of these individual backlogs. One of the challenges here is that you have to invest a lot of time in building that program level backlog. And again, it works best in a homogeneous program. One product, it's fairly straightforward in that case. A second model is bottom up, where features and stories are defined in the team backlogs, and those feed or are consolidated into a program level backlog. Where each one of those teams has its own product, maybe they're related ones, but they're individual separate applications, for example. This might work out well because the program level backlog winds up being more of a reporting mechanism. Maybe we don't have to drive too much cross-team prioritization, in which case this model might work. I haven't actually used this model, but some of my colleagues have, and it has worked in relatively simple situations where each of those teams are developing different things. The third model, is the one that we see most often. It's complex, but it works out really well. And this is where the burden of prioritization falls where it should be. I know that's a very nebulous thing to say, but we let the product owners figure it out, basically. So high-level stuff is figured out and prioritized at the program level, where the Uber product owner is prioritizing big things. Individual stories, which might be parts of developing features and such, for example, those are prioritized at the team level. And there's back and forth. There's constant feedback loops. Maybe during the Metascrum, these discussions are happening where we do prioritization across. And if there's ever a prioritization change in one of the teams that impacted the bigger backlog and impacted other teams, then we just have that discussion with the Metascrum team. So this would support complex prioritization at any level. We use this on, like I said, projects of many teams working together. It works pretty nicely because it distributes the burden of figuring out where things should be prioritized to the product owners to figure out on their own. So then it can work for pretty much any situation. But it requires coordination and collaboration, as anything should, I think. Okay, this is a topic I want to talk about a lot because this is glossed over a lot. Maybe we can make those teams work as teams and effectively deliver product according to their individual backlogs. And maybe we can even get to this model I just described about scaling it to the program where we have cross-team collaboration all delivering the same product or related products. But then there's the organization as a whole. I have around this model some groups of people who are not part of core Scrum or program level Scrum. Groups like infrastructure, architecture, database administrators, managers, just general development managers, for example, or test managers. These are people who might not have roles on the Agile teams, and this can be a challenge in a lot of ways. One, because they're people who used to be directly managing people's efforts. Maybe they can't seem to find their place. That's one of my favorite topics is, what do new managers do? What do former managers do that aren't the Scrum Master or the product owner or anything like that? It's actually critical that these people understand Agile, and we talked about some stakeholder education before, and have a way to help the teams. So what we usually do is let's go over here. An example of how to deal with that is creating something called a program enablement team. Now this could be formal or informal depending on the organization, but it's something that's worked a number of times for us. This is where managers, people like shared experts such as DBAs as we see there, and architects, executives, other stakeholders, they can be organized as their own Scrum team, or it could be loosely organized. But the point is that those people, their goal is to support the overall program. So one thing we've done as a Scrum team is a set of existing managers, for example, dev managers, who don't have a spot on any of the Agile teams, would form their own Scrum team called, and they call themselves, in one example, the pointy-haired bosses team, where they appointed a Scrum master, they appointed a product owner, and their product was any issue or obstacle that the teams were facing. So this allowed that team to actually add value to the overall program, because anything that the team ran into, any of the teams ran into, that they couldn't solve on their own, went to this program enablement team. Their job was to enable the teams to succeed. So oftentimes we run into things like compliance processes. The Agile team isn't developing requirements as it used to. It's not developing gigantic requirements documents that get approved and go through a big process and traceability to tests and all these other things, test cases and other things. We have a different set of things that we look at. So compliance might be raised as an obstacle. That program enablement team, or some subset of it, might take that on as a story and come up with a way for these teams to pass an audit, for example. An example we have here was that the enablement team in my current client, we came up with we did a session on how to pass an audit for Agile teams. So what we did was went back to the risks that the compliance process was created for, understood those risks, and discussed how Agile projects also mitigate the same risks but in different ways. Then that team could come up with a list of things for auditors to look for on Agile teams that mitigate the same risks. Usually it results in a slightly different compliance process. But the important thing here is that those people who were previously managers and other shared experts are used to help enable the teams to succeed. More directly affecting the teams include things like architecture. How do we do architecture on large programs, or on Agile projects at all, for that matter? What we usually do is I usually demand an architect on any program, and they're typically responsible for overall holistic architectural concerns. And I believe I have it in here. Here it is. They might have their own informal team of experts, and each one of them is probably a member of one of the individual teams. They might meet on their own occasionally to discuss architectural concerns, but they're responsible for making sure that anything each of those teams do is within standards. If it's not within standards, they should escalate that as an obstacle or an issue so that they can get the help they need. Examples in big clients include architectural blueprints or technical blueprints, where if you're solving a certain type of business problem, you should use a certain technical approach to it. These people should know about what those approaches are and should help the teams, their individual teams, implement things that way. And if they're trying to introduce a new technology, they should know that that we're trying a new technology. I probably should talk to the centralized architecture group about this thing. They can raise that as an obstacle and work out a way to work with a centralized architecture team to perhaps get their trial of the new technology approved. So the important thing here is we're distributing a lot of the burden of architecture to members on the team, but we are making people accountable for it. A benefit of this is that they'll come up with their own standards. They may use standards, since they can meet together on their own to talk about cross-program architectural issues. They can share coding standards, other things they come up with, definition of done type stuff, where they're inspecting what level of doneness or quality do they expect out of every iteration. So they can also provide technical guidance and advice. By meeting together, they can share technical challenges that they've overcome. Okay, another challenge on scaling is distributed teams. More and more we have projects that the team members are separated across geographical boundaries, like in different countries even. We've experienced that a lot. It's important to differentiate the difference between distributed and virtual teams. As much as possible, if we are going to do distributed development, we'd like to have independent teams in one location so they can benefit from all those things we know are good in Agile projects, co-location, where they can use big visible information radiators, and collaborate in person as opposed to over less effective communication mechanisms like email and phone calls. But sometimes you do have a virtual team where individual team members are distributed across different locations. Each one of those situations requires different ways to mitigate the risk of people being distributed. So we do prefer distributed teams. Sometimes it's not possible. I'm going to talk about distributed teams briefly. Here's an example of distributed Scrum teams where we have 4 teams, each in a different location, but each is self-sufficient, just like we talked about earlier. An important goal of the scaling model is that teams are self-sufficient. The closer they are, the better that they're going to be at being self-sufficient and executing effectively. Okay, something to avoid if you're doing distributed development is functionally siloed teams. Your developers are in Boston, and your testers are in India, and your business experts are in some other location. This is extremely difficult to make work. If you are doing distributed development, anything you can do to mitigate this and get teams to be self-sufficient in their locations is going to help you out. We have a separate training we do on something called the ambassador model that can help come up with something like that. But this is going to increase the cost of communicating, and it's going to increase delays and a whole bunch of other challenges. So I want to skip to scaling strategies and some lessons learned. We believe there are 2 fundamental approaches to scaling. When you want to introduce Agile, you can start with a team, or you can just say, hey, we're all going to do Agile. So here's the Big Bang approach. The other is a phased approach. What is the Big Bang approach? Well, the Big Bang approach is where basically someone in a powerful leadership position comes in and say, hey, everybody, we're going to do Agile starting tomorrow. We might get some training in there, and we might try to train a whole bunch of teams at the same time and get them all kick-started. This approach is very, very, very difficult to execute properly. It results in lots of inefficiencies. It often results in things like phenomenon like Scrummer fall and Scrum butt, where teams are basically just kind of winging it. They don't get the help they need. Agile is so much not just a different set of practices and a different set of process steps. It's much more than that. It's changes in value system. It's changes in the way we collaborate and the things we value. People need a lot more help to do this. So telling everybody they're Agile and expecting them to go at it the next day is not an approach I recommend. You usually rush your team selection. The product owner and Scrum Master roles might not be former product managers or former project managers, respectively. They might be other people who emerge. It's often, in my opinion, it's often more personality-based than it is past experience-based. Having a bigger audience means you're spreading out your coaching and training expertise across more teams. It means thinner support for everybody. When you expect teams to jump into this stuff, there's not really a lot of time for them to establish a rhythm with the help they need to get to that rhythm. It's going to result in teams going slower and having a lot more challenges. I believe the adoption is much poorer when you do this, and people are unhappy, they're stressed out. It just looks like another leadership-imposed change. So we can share some experiences about that too, because we have tried that method before. Not on a recommendation, though. I believe a more responsible approach is this phased approach. The phases can be rapid or slow. Depends on your problem, your business, your organization, the people involved. What we like to do is 1 or 2 teams at a time, and that might scale out depending on the number of people you have coaching and training. It gives us a wider window to really assess the team members and to help the teams find the right people for their roles. Usually those types of the right people for Scrum Master roles, for example, emerge. And this allows us to benefit from that. We can see the people who are actually the natural leaders, the natural people who help people communicate together, and that's the type of people we want as Scrum Masters, not necessarily a former project manager. So it's easier to schedule, and it's easier to assess how you're going. If you're ramping up 1 or 2 teams at a time, and then, and I'll show you how that scales to multiple teams, then it's easier to have a very controlled, managed approach where things just aren't completely chaotic. It works great for coaching too, because coaching, mentoring, training is very expensive. This way you can focus that coaching on getting the best benefit out of those coaches by ramping a team up to a certain level of maturity so that they actually learn how to do Agile and they learn how to work together and successfully deliver a product and aren't just following the motions. And I also believe it results in happier people. It's not a death march. Here's an example. This is just an example. It usually never plays out exactly this way. The timing might change. But in week 1, we have that stuff we talked about earlier where we're working with management and doing stakeholder analysis and all that stuff. And in the subsequent weeks, we'll do team ramp up where we do training, backlog discovery. We talked about business discovery earlier, things like that in iteration 0. And then get them started as soon as possible into their actual iterations. We believe that only a very brief time spent on training is useful. And getting people to actually do this stuff is far more effective. So I actually don't even recommend this many weeks for a particular team. Usually that sort of thing, I think even on a large program, can take 2 weeks to do discovery, team setup, and get them into iteration 1. Oh, this probably includes iteration 0. That's probably why it says 3 weeks. Point is there, we're going to get team to a certain level of maturity. Then they'll be a little bit able to proceed on their own. We'll move on to the next set of teams and keep checking in on the first team very actively until such time as they're much more mature. And this is just one model, but it shows the phased approach. And this is pretty rapid, so we're moving from one team right to another. Okay, there's the breakdown of the stuff we talked about in the beginning. Specifically, we might do team formulation, training, as well as the visioning workshop, a backlog discovery workshop. How do we come up with our first initial backlog? Sizing and estimation. Project environment setup is the stuff we do in iteration 0. And the assessments, as you see on the bottom, is ongoing. We're always going to do those things. It's an important part of coaching. So specific challenges and success factors. Here are some things that you can expect to deal with if you're introducing Agile in a large way. Cross-project and cross-program communication. It's very easy to do Agile in a team. It's not so easy to ensure that teams are working together on the same goals. So expect to need to introduce constructs like the one we talked about, like the Scrum of Scrums and the Meta Scrum, to resolve cross-team issues and to continue to do holistic product planning. Managing the program backlog, that can be really complex, especially if you are sending work for multiple products through multiple teams. It's a little bit simpler if you have one product, but still it's relatively complex. That Uber product owner role becomes very, very important. Shared services, architecture groups, database administration groups, things like this that are common in large organizations. How do we get them to support our teams as much as we need them? The requests are going to be much more real-time. That's where that stakeholder analysis and working an engagement model with those groups to support our teams effectively is really important. Just as important in shared services, again, is the Scrum of Scrums, that cross-team issues meeting, where we are, where teams are able to escalate their need for shared services. Constant and continuous education, not just for the teams, but also for stakeholders, to help them. I believe that one of my jobs, probably more than half of my time is spent working with people outside of the teams once they're actually moving pretty well, because those groups need to now adapt to how the teams are delivering software and come up with a model to help support those teams. And finally, probably most importantly, external forces. What are the rules that teams in the past have had to follow that we still have to follow because those rules haven't changed? Often compliance processes are examples. Approval processes for access to things, all sorts of things that exist. These are things that we want to start assessing and start escalating as possible obstacles to successful product development. And culture. Every organization has a different culture. Sometimes every group in every organization has a different culture. Are people willing to collaborate? Are they scared because their managers are people who used to be very command and control and would not be receptive to honest feedback? This is a very common situation, and it's part of stakeholder education. We probably don't want a Scrum Master who used to be the development manager of that team because the team members aren't going to be comfortable sharing very objective feedback about something that's bad to someone who's going to be doing their assessment. These are the types of things we have to deal with. Technically, you have to deal with those on individual teams as well, but they become even bigger when we're talking about the larger organization. One other thing I want to mention there are things like HR, which are things we don't consider human resources. How are the career paths affected now when the project manager role goes away and we have a Scrum Master role instead? That's not based on conformance to plan or normal project management things. It's more based on How are you facilitating things, and how is your team succeeding? How are you resolving obstacles for your team? These are big things that are all part of the scaling problem. So some pitfalls to avoid if you're trying to do this. Don't ramp up too fast. I don't recommend telling everybody to just go Agile tomorrow without getting sufficient help. Avoid focusing on standardization. Everywhere I've gone, one of the first questions, especially with managers and methodology groups and such, is how do we come up with our brand of Agile so that we can make it easier for teams to implement Agile? We can just come up with our specific thing. I recommend not doing this because one of the benefits of Agile is that it's gonna change all the time. It's all about change. It's all about learning. Your teams are going to come up with the best method of implementing it themselves. So having consistent guidance is one thing, but having specific standards is going to result in us not benefiting from some of the most important aspects of Agile, which include continuous improvement, collaboration, empowerment, things like that. Changing the word standardization to something more on consistent guidance is probably important in that area. Conflicts of interest, if we had, again, traditional roles, you sometimes have a conflict of interest if you are assigning a Scrum Master who reports to a product owner, for example. I've seen people want to do things like that with existing managers because it's easier from an organizational perspective, but it's going to cause problems. Focusing on too many inefficiencies, don't worry about maximizing velocity and productivity. A separate topic, but those efforts usually result in nothing but problems. Don't focus on effort. Focus on the results. How is the product evolving? Are we making good decisions? So don't worry about effort and tracking actuals and things like that. Again, another big topic. And last thing, keys to success. Get strong Scrum Masters and product owners. This is why I really recommend that initial stakeholder evaluation. Again, stakeholders include team members. We want to find the right Scrum Master. These are people teams are going to rally around. Product owners the same. We want the product champion. We don't want someone who is who's going to be hiding and who's going to be in their own office all the time and not really interfacing with the team. We want someone who's very happy to work with the team, who's going to be looking at the product all the time and be aware of the information so they can assess any changes they need to make for future prioritization and get any changes, information resulting from any changes to our release plans to the right stakeholders so that they know what's going on all the time. Ensure that there's executive support, absolutely critical. Manage your bottlenecks. Focus on those bottlenecks first and improve processes there. Constantly examine existing processes. Never treat anything as a rule you just have to deal with. If there's one of those and people just say, oh, we just have to deal with that compliance process because it's the compliance process, escalate that as an obstacle in your Scrum of Scrums and have that owned by the Uber Scrum Master, and maybe have that enablement team start considering what does compliance mean to us and can we do anything to help the compliance group come up with a new set of rules for our teams. Okay, and get help. I think help is absolutely critical. Getting someone objective who's not tied down by the same rules, who's not used to the way of doing things in your organization. Usually this means an external consulting or something like that. They're going to help you solve some of the biggest problems which happen day to day. They tend not to be process or agile problems. They tend to be problems with the organization more than anything. So getting someone who's experienced with dealing with all those problems is absolutely critical. And that's where I'm going to stop because I think my time is done. Here's some contact information. We also have some information about some upcoming training that we're doing. Thank you very much for your time. So I'm going to turn it over for a question and answer session now.
Excellent. So we do have some questions that came in. The first question is, can you expand on the importance of executive support and dedication and what the risks are of not getting that support? Okay. I'm going to go into my personal opinion about this thing. I think that support in general is the most critical part of any Agile initiative, any introduction anyway. When people ask me what are the criteria for a project or for an organization implementing Agile, my answer is that the first order criteria are executive support and team support for the change. Everywhere I've seen Agile introduced, the biggest challenges aren't ones that are in engineering. They're in organizational change. Especially if you have a large organization that has lots of existing processes, lots of things that we say that's just the way we do it around here. Agile is going to bump into those and it's going to treat those as obstacles. So making sure you have support to go around rules like compliance rules for now while we work out a new way to do compliance is absolutely critical. The executive support is going to be critical for doing that. Executive support is going to be critical in making sure that people who are used to managing a certain way, like development managers are used to being able to go to any particular developer at any time and saying, hey, drop what you're doing, work on this latest fire. I see this in every single organization.
if your executives aren't supporting some of the concepts that make Agile successful, such as dedicated teams and self-organizing teams, those development managers are going to still behave the way they used to. So they really need to know that executives support the changes in culture, in the way we manage, the way we lead. Another example is introducing quality. Most of the places I go to don't understand software quality. They don't understand the value of automated testing and how it's absolutely necessary as you're building more software that regression test becomes bigger and bigger and harder to maintain. You have to introduce that automation. Having executives understand the value of investing in that automation and in things like that is the only way you're really going to be able to get people to actually implement it.
Very good. The next question that we have is, when is a good time to bring in consulting help?
Oh, I believe right when you're even considering Agile. Even you can usually get someone in a lightweight way just to talk about what Agile is and what Agile isn't. There's probably some benefit to doing that when you even first think of the word, because it's very easy to take white papers and books and things like that, and even a training session, and expect to give it a try. But as I mentioned before, the challenges aren't usually in implementing Scrum. Scrum is a fairly straightforward, simple process. But once you actually start doing it, you bump into all sorts of challenges. Understanding the implications of moving to Agile and what different people are now going to be expected to do and accountable for is critical. And it might not be in all the books. It's in some of the newer books out there. But that's where having an experienced outside help can help you understand what is the scope of what you're trying to do really here, so we understand what we're trying to do, so that we understand the implications. So as soon as possible, I'll say.
Okay. Next question is, you talked about architects in Agile teams. What about QA?
Oh, okay. I skipped QA. I'm sorry. I think that Agile places such a high emphasis on testing that I often assume it's like a given that QA is constantly going on. So I mentioned development managers. The same is true for like QA managers. We're no longer functionally organized in an effective Agile organization. We have teams that are self-sufficient. That includes testers. The testers sign on to more team-based goals than they do functional goals. So some things I've seen work are those QA managers being part of that program enablement team. And in fact, I'm going to take this feedback and update the slide with this. But I've seen effective situations where the QA managers became part of that program enablement team and started learning about things like the value of automated testing and automated test tools and such, and going across to the teams and trying to learn some of the practices that have worked in each of those teams and introducing automated testing. Most of the organizations I work in do not have automated test scaffolds or anything like that when we first get there. So we have to introduce it to legacy code bases, which is a whole nother challenge. Learning ways that some teams have done that effectively, taking that knowledge and sharing it with other teams can be really effective. That's a great program enablement team effort for QA management. But the testing effort, part of the team, it should happen all the time during the iterations as much as possible. So when your software at the end of the iteration is done, it should be really done without bugs. And with automated tests. That includes functional automation as well as like unit test automation.
Okay. The next question we have is, how do you take into account career development paths?
This is a huge question. So there's a couple of challenges here. One is that usually the existing career development path that in an organization is something along the lines of a project manager. And the things that they're rewarded for and the things that they have to do to progress are different from what a Scrum Master has to do, for example. Every organization is going to have to solve this differently. But what I usually do in an organization is start working with the HR people right when starting a large enterprise engagement. We need to educate them, help them understand the different roles in Agile, the different things it values, and help them start brainstorming and working with the people who are implementing it, the actual Scrum Masters even, to come up with a different way of assessing project managers, Scrum Masters, the new roles, and career paths. It's really an exercise for each organization to figure out on their own, just like they figured out their original one with the traditional project management and the traditional roles. But spending time educating HR people from the beginning and getting them involved is absolutely critical. And usually you'll find out that the HR people are very interested in this stuff, and they actually like it because the Agile stuff with all of its focus on collaboration and things like servant leadership is really consistent with a lot of the training they received on building motivated teams and organizations. So that we're combining the two into a process is really exciting. Now the burden should be on them to help to start having conversations with people who are actually going through it to come up with a better way to provide career tracks for people. So there is no one answer specifically, but getting those people involved is critical.
Very good. The next question we have is around reporting standards when you have multiple teams.
Oh yeah, I like this one. Absolutely. Teams might actually use their own tools. Especially in the beginning, they might be starting off with something like a task board and starting off with a spreadsheet until they're able to use some of the more advanced tools. One thing I like to do is, in the beginning, define an adapter, so to speak, or an interface to teams where, as long as teams are providing the same information, how they provide it, how they gather the data is really not important to me. So initially we'll start with every team must have a burn down chart, a release burn down chart, as well as constantly an iteration burn down chart for their iteration. And they must be reporting things like velocity and issues and obstacles. If every team is reporting at least those minimal things, there might be a few other things depending on the organization, then we should be able to consolidate that information to a cross-program view. There may be some benefit to consolidated tools to generate that. It depends on the organization. But to start, the burden should just be provide the following types of information in a certain way. If they have different tools to use that initially, that's fine. Eventually they might realize efficiencies on consolidating those tools. Hope that answers it.
Very good. That was the last question that we have so far. So if any of the attendees have any additional questions, please go ahead and get those in quickly. If not, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to you, George, if you've got any kind of last thoughts or best practices.
Okay, yeah, let's see. One thing I always like to keep in mind is that we don't have to solve everyone's problem with a particular specific practice. Oftentimes when people have questions about how they fit into a larger Agile program, getting them together to brainstorm on ways they can help focus on team enablement is extremely effective because they'll come up with ways. I mentioned a team of managers on a huge program that got together and decided they're going to be their own Scrum team because they didn't see how they fit into the model because we already had Scrum Masters and product owners and new product owners and all that fun stuff. They came together and said, we want to be our own Scrum team, and our job is going to be to help knock down all these organizational walls we're running into, help come up with a compliance process, help facilitate the architectural conversations that we have to have in a different way now. No longer are we doing things where architects go off into a room and come up with the proposed system architecture in a very detailed way. It's much more collaborative. Let's help them now work together to emerge an architecture, to come up with maybe an initial conceptual one, but evolve it over time and introduce the feedback loop so that we're learning from the teams and sharing learning with the teams to influence future stories and stuff like that. Distributing the burden of figuring those things out to those people who have become managers because of competence and because of experience is a real big success factor. Not having to figure that out centralized and not having to standardize that stuff is key. Lots of challenges, and I'd love to go into more detail on any of these, but each one of them is like a whole topic on its own.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And George, I think you have some contact information that you'd like to share with the attendees so they know if they've got any additional questions they can follow up with you guys.
Sure. On the slide right now is some email contact information, myself or Peter. Our website is listed on top there. We have a blog and other things if people are interested. We also have, on the training site there are certified Scrum Master trainings coming up in Northeast and in Southern California. We have I believe there's a discount code on there as well that we can distribute later for people who are attending this event.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. It was an excellent presentation. And again, if any of the attendees want to get in touch with you guys, there's your information.
Thank you.